Welcome everybody to tonight's online lecture event. I'm very happy to see you. And of course, particular welcome to Ainslie Hepburn, who has very kindly agreed to talk about a book that she brought out, a book on a most extraordinary personality who, a man who grew up in a well-to-do German Jewish family, fought in the German army in the First World War, was forced to emigrate by the Nazis, became, I think, a captain eventually in the British Army, had a very sort of fascinating time interpreting, looking after German prisoners of war, and then had a career as a bridge builder between Germany and the United Kingdom for many, many years, for decades after the war. Really an interesting man, and we're delighted to be able to hear a bit more about him. Yes, Ainslie Hepburn is a writer and an historian, and she has spent a lot of time researching the life of this extraordinary man. And so without further ado, the floor is yours to tell us about Herbert Sulzbach.
Thank you very much indeed. I have got some pictures to show you about his life, so I'm just going to share my screen, and hopefully that will allow you to see those pictures. This is the cover of my book, A Jew Who Defeated Nazism. It's about Herbert Sulzbach and the peace, reconciliation, and the new Germany that he very much hoped for. I'm going to rattle through quite a few of the early slides because I just want to give you an idea of the sort of man he was and the sort of life he lived, which changed magnificently throughout his entire life. I don't think I've ever read so many times somebody writing, and then my new life started, as one thing changed after another throughout his life. So he started by he was born into a family in a very well-to-do banker's family in Frankfurt. And this is the street that he lived in. All his neighbors were other bankers, lawyers, jewelers, and in a very Jewish area. This is his father standing outside their villa, their big house in Friedrichstrasse in Frankfurt. He had been a banker. The money from the bank came from his grandfather setting up Gebrüder Sulzbach in the 18th century. And then he decided himself that he no longer wanted to carry on banking, although obviously the money was still coming his way, and he wanted to be a musician. And so about 4 years before Herbert Sulzbach was born, he composed and involved himself entirely in music. And this is the house that they grew up in, that Herbert and his brother and sister grew up in, a large villa with a very big balcony that was a good place for having family photos taken, like his mother, Julia, his brother and sister, Ernst and Lily. Ernst was the oldest. He was 7 years older than Herbert, and Lily 5 years older. Three of them got on very well together. It was a rich family with a car. Apparently in 1904, the chairman of the car company actually brought the car around for them just all on his own. And you can see here the chauffeur, Herr Blank, who looked after the car and the family, a series of cars, one of which ended up being sent to the front in the First World War. His English governess was there because Emil Sulzbach, Herbert's father, very much wanted his children to learn and speak fluent English and also French. Herbert also had a tutor, and he also went to Goethe Gymnasium later on. They had a very rich life with holidays by the seaside. And here you don't see Herbert himself, but you do see two of his friends, the two young princes of Hesse, both of whom were later on schoolmates with him at Goethe Gymnasium, and were both of them killed in the First World War. The hunting lodge, the Act House up in the Spessart Mountains, was built at the very beginning of the 20th century, 1912, and they had a lot of entertaining there. This is the visitor's book that you had to sign. Most people didn't just sign their name and say thank you very much for a lovely weekend. They had to compose or paint a picture or write a poem or something very artistic and cultural. A lot of money from the bank or from the Sulzbach family was contributed to the life in Frankfurt, including here the Palmengarten, which was just around the corner from where they lived. And so it was a very it was a Jewish family, but a very assimilated Jewish family. They really didn't consider themselves as very much as Jews at all. They were within their social class, socializing very much. Then the First World War happened, and straight away, Herbert Sulzbach, who was by then 20 years old, 22 years old, in fact, sorry, he volunteered for the local Frankfurt regiment, and he was a gunner for the entire war, and he survived it. This was his part of his regiment in France, in Evricourt. And here he is outside his bunker, wearing his, you can see on his left breast pocket, his Iron Cross. He got the Iron Cross second class during the Battle of the Somme, and first class during the retreats of July 1918, when he managed to get all his horses and all his men safely back without losing either one or the other. These are all the medals that throughout his life he managed to acquire, and strangely for the times, which just shows, I suppose, what a mad sort of time we all lived through in Europe at that time, he was awarded 9 different medals from 6 different heads of state. So a crazy world, as one of his friends said. After the war, he went back home to Frankfurt and didn't really know what he wanted to do. Except having failed his Abitur, he still had a job in the bank. And here he is. He found it really quite difficult and he didn't enjoy the work very much. But here he is back in his study at home with his tutor, trying to learn what on earth you had to do to be a successful banker. He also wanted, after the war, to go back into the social circle that he had known beforehand. And he was discharged from the army in December 1918. And before Christmas, he'd accepted an invitation to a birthday party of Margaret Rockel, who was one of his friends in Frankfurt. And the following May, they got married. The year after that, their baby daughter was born, and here you see Margot and their baby. Although since Herbert didn't like the working in the bank, his father and his father-in-law decided to put up the money for him to be a director of a fancy paper factory, which was outside between Potsdam and Berlin at Babelsberg. This is the Babelsberg Park, and this is the factory that it's the building where he had a fancy paper factory. It is still there in Neubabelsberg, which was well served by the new train line, etc., in the 1920s. He had a very young and loyal staff working for him, but at the same time, things were bad financially, and in the factory it wasn't that successful, and neither was his marriage. And it was in 2 years after he got married, the two of them, Margaret and Herbert, decided to separate. Later on that year, and just before his divorce came through, he met Beate Scherk, who was the great love of his life, and she stayed with him, the two of them together, for the rest of their days. They were married in 1923. And here you see Beata as an actress in the Expressionist theatre in Berlin, which in itself was a very exciting time. Herbert loved the social life with Beata and the artistic community there. And he also enjoyed a much better time in the factory over the next few years. And until the early 1930s, he managed to travel a lot and to expand his work, his fancy paperwork, as it were, in other areas in Paris, in Amsterdam, and in the UK. And here you see the road in which he and Beata lived. They lived in a flat on the right-hand side of this road, and this was taken on the last day that they were living there. Because in 1933, Beata was no longer allowed to work as an actress, and they decided to leave. Herbert came over to England first. He came over with his daughter from his first marriage, and he set up a factory here in the UK, which failed almost as soon as it started, but it did at least allow him to get over here. And then he was backwards and forwards to Berlin to help his wife and her sister to emigrate. And here you see the two women. Beata is the one facing the camera directly, on slightly to the left or in the center of the picture, and her sister Rupert is on the right, and they're on the boat to Southampton. From Southampton they went to London, and the two women stayed with an aunt there while Herbert stayed in a guest house. By then their fortunes were very, very much reduced, and Herbert had no work. He went, in fact, over to Basel to try to work with other German people, some Jews, but not all, working there to try to let the world know what was going on in Germany, to try to make known what the horrors of Nazism were. War broke out just after he returned back to England. The Second World War broke out then. And within a few months, he and Beata were up before a tribunal because of the fear in Britain of a fifth column of all these German people in the country. And it's quite a long story, which is told in the book about why that happened. But he and Beata were interned as a result of the tribunal hearing. And this is a picture taken 25 years later when Beata, whom you see standing in the front there, returned to Holloway Prison, which is where she was interned as a common criminal in May 1940. Herbert, on the other hand, was sent to the Isle of Man, where internment camps were arranged for the men. And here you can see out from Onken, the place on the Isle of Man where his camp was, out to sea, and he hated every single minute of being there, as you can imagine. In the end, 6 weeks after her arrival at Holloway Prison, Beata was also interned on the Isle of Man, and they met up just once. You can see Beata just on the right. She's got a short fur coat on, and she's striding out there right on the edge of the right-hand edge of the picture. And all of the women had come on a coach to be taken to a huge complex where, in a great big hall, they met up with their menfolk for the first time for weeks and weeks. But Herbert was allowed, by October 1940, the men were allowed to be discharged from the internment camp if they joined the British Army. Herbert was delighted to do this. He had actually tried to belong to any army of any country that was fighting the Nazis, and he felt that his experience in the First World War would be able, when he became an officer, etc., could be put to good use. And he found himself actually incredibly bored as a British soldier, mainly working on the south coast to put up barriers for an expected invasion. And here you see him working in the early days, working with Canadian lumberjacks, in point of fact, on the south coast of England. Quite a demanding role for a man who was no longer particularly young. And in the summer of July 1943, the place where Beata was living was bombed, and Herbert had compassionate leave to go and help her. And they lived in a bomb shelter in the garden, and can see them with some of their luggage. This was the second time they'd been bombed out. While they were on the Isle of Man, their flat in London had been bombed out, and so had been bombed, and so they were absolutely homeless and no money after having lived a very wealthy lifestyle some years previously. Towards the end of the war, at the end of 1944, the British Army was looking for interpreters for people who could particularly speak German. And there wasn't any volunteering for this. And very reluctantly, Herbert Sulzbach found himself as an interpreter at a prisoner of war camp for German prisoners. And he was sent to Scotland. And here you can see the huts that are still remaining. I took this picture some years back in Scotland, near Perth. And there were 4,000 men in this camp, 4,000 young National Socialists who had known nothing throughout their education other than National Socialism. And so they were actually really committed Nazis, all young, hardly an officer amongst them. And when Herbert arrived in January 1945, some few weeks previously, during the Christmas at the end of 44, they had actually managed to string up and murder one of their own prisoners, one of their comrades. It was an extraordinary atmosphere in the camp, not an easy one. Herbert was there. This is the inside of one of those huts where 80 men would live in double bunks, 20 down each side, so 80 men all together. Scotland's always pretty cold, and this is not a picture that was taken at the time that Herbert Sulzbach was there, so there was one heater in the middle for the men, and if coal got a bit scarce, they got slightly cold. And this is Herbert Sulzbach working that year. He worked the entire of 1945 at this camp near Cymru called Culti Bragan. And before the end of the war, so he was there for sort of 5 months before the end of the war, about 5 or 6 months afterwards. Before the war ended, it was very, very difficult indeed for him to try to make contact with these men. Their whole outlook in life was completely different from any that he would have wanted. And they were totally committed to the Nazi cause. He was responsible, Herbert Sulzbach was responsible for censoring the letters. So he had a good idea of the mental state of many of those men as they wrote home. And he was horrified at their insistence that everything would go well for them. When the war came to an end in Europe in May 1945, everything changed dramatically, and it was much easier for him to make contact with those men. His job was to be an interpreter of the language, but throughout his time as an interpreter, he saw himself as interpreting ideas and ideals as well. So he tried to make individual contact with people. He tried to impress upon them the facts, the truth of what was going on. He copied out newspaper articles for them and really worked hard to try to help them to understand rather more democratic ideals than those that they had grown up with. A lot of the work was helped along by people's involvement with music. There was a huge program of all sorts of activities, including music, and this is a program of one of the concerts. And it was while he was at Cymru, one of the most important times of his days of his life really came. And that was in November, which was the first Remembrance Day after the end of the Second World War. Now, one of the ways that Herbert Sulzbach could relate to these young men was that he knew what it was like to be a soldier of that age. It was on Armistice Day on the 11th of November 1918 that he had to read out to his men that the guns would go silent. And on this particular day, as the first day of remembering the armistice after the Second World War, he wanted to impress upon the men in the camp that there was a different way of living, that there was a different way of understanding relationships between countries. And he wrote out this poem, which in Flanders Fields, which is a poem from the First World War, which meant a lot to him. You can, excuse me, you can see how patched up this piece of paper is. And he folded it and he mended it and kept it in his pocket until the day he died. And he had a suggestion to the men in the camp, which was that on this day he should copy what the host country would do, and that is to go on parade and remember all of the dead of both wars, that it wasn't a triumphal celebration, it was a remembering day, but that they should only do that if they would take a vow. And he gave them a vow and said to them, we will be out on parade, but you may only come if you are prepared to accept this vow yourself. And this is the vow I'm reading now from the book that I wrote. Never again shall such murder take place. It is the last time that we will allow ourselves to be deceived and betrayed. It is not true that we Germans are a superior race. We have no right to believe that we are better than others. We are all equal before God, whatever our race or religion. Endless misery has come to us, and we have realized where arrogance leads. At this moment, we swear to return to Germany as good Europeans and to take part, as long as we live, in the reconciliation of all people and the maintenance of peace. And there were only a very, very few men who stayed in their huts that day. The rest of the 4,000 went out on parade. And in the many ways that Herbert Sulzbach worked to help those men to change their minds, to change their attitudes, had been noted by his superiors. And at the end of 1945, he was sent to a different camp to be an interpreter there. He was sent a bit further south, just south of the Scottish border, to a castle, Featherstone Castle, and you can see it here. It's a painting by one of the prisoners who was a prisoner of war in the grounds of the castle, which is just to the right. And this is a model of that camp. It was made by prisoners, and it was a huge, huge model. Nobody knows quite what happened to it, but it is set out exactly like the one in Cymru. 4,000 men in 4 camps, four compounds of 1,000 people. On the left here, you can see the river South Tyne, and to the top right, where those trees are, that's sort of going up the hill with the castle somewhat out of sight on the top left. And it was here that he worked to do exactly the same as he had done in the previous camp, but in this camp was the cream of the German army. These were the very senior men who had been taken prisoner, and they were the big fear of the Allies after the Second World War was that the officers in particular would go back to Germany and rearm, and it would all start all over again. And so it was very necessary, as they saw at the time, to come up with a new way of democratic thinking, a new way of looking at life. This was not quite as difficult to understand as with the youngsters in the previous camp. These men were all older. Many of them were the same age as Herbert Sulzbach. Many of them had gone through the same educational process as him, and were used to ideals of enlightenment that had been taught through the Goethe Gymnasium and similar schools across Germany at that time, at the time that they had been at school. And so he was able to, with long conversations, with music, with lectures, with all sorts of ways of coming together with these people, he could helpfully and hopefully come up with a better democratic vision. This is him in his hut, his own hut, where he slept, as you can see. He also worked there. You can see the little typewriter there, but he also had another hut that was where he worked and where he interviewed on a one-to-one basis every single man in the camp. This required quite a large number of people helping him, and there were 12 of the prisoners of war clerks who helped him to do that. This was the team that was in charge of the camp. You can see Herbert Sulzbach standing in the middle in his British Army uniform. His wife is visiting, and she's sitting just in front of him. And to the left of Herbert Sulzbach, also in uniform, is Colonel Vickers, who was the commandant in charge of the camp. And he was an extraordinarily successful commandant who everybody loved, and even the German prisoners. And he very much impressed upon them his own view. I will just read you what one prisoner wrote when he first turned up at the camp. He says, when we sat down to our first meal, the camp commandant came along. He asked us where and how we had been taken into captivity and inquired after our health. And so that we knew that he was not stamped with hatred of Germans, Colonel Vickers gave a welcome speech, which was also very sincere. He himself had been taken prisoner by the Germans and had always been treated as a gentleman. For him, that was unforgettable. In any case, he would do all that he possibly could to make our captivity easier. And that was written by Hermann Zioch, who later became press officer at the German embassy in Cairo. And so Herbert Sulzbach and Colonel Vickers, there was a third man, General Ferdinand Heim, who was a German general and the spokesman for the German prisoners. And the three of them worked very, very closely and well together to create this different atmosphere where people could look towards democracy and a different sort of idealism. There was a camp paper where everybody put their own ideas in and discussed what they wanted to see as the future Germany, and also had reviews of plays that were being put on in the camp, etc. I can't go into all the details, but I have available for anybody who wants to see it a sample chapter, which is this chapter I've chosen to be able to be available for you, that the publishers have made available. And so you can find out more. This newspaper was written in German. It was not censored at all. It was Sulzbach's job to make sure it appeared, but he didn't censor it at all, which came as a bit of a surprise to many of the prisoners. And it was printed on the local presses. This is yet another program for a musical evening. And there were lectures. Here you see Herbert Sulzbach after the war in 1954 with Adele Schreiber, who was a German woman who had very different views from Nazi Germany, and so fled to London. And she came all the way up to the north of England at that time, very difficult transport, etc., just after the war, and was one of the lecturers. And here you see him at that time. One of the things about Featherstone Park was that Herbert Sulzbach's relationship with the German prisoners of war meant that he made his peace with the Germany that he knew was going to come into being, the Germany that he loved so dearly from his youth and wanted to see reinvigorated for the future. This is just one of the prisoners that I just want to bring to your attention. His name is Kurt Schwiderski, and you see him here in his hut at Featherstone Park as a prisoner. He was taken prisoner at the end of the war in France, and he had worked in the law department of his town in Dusseldorf before the war, and when he was at Featherstone Park, he borrowed a book from the library at the camp about Treblinka, and he found it an extraordinary book, and he was fascinated by it. He was fascinated that anybody could possibly write such a fantasy. He found it amazing, and then he realized, he got to know that it was not a fantasy, that Treblinka had actually happened. And when he returned to Germany after the war, a couple of years after his imprisonment, he became a judge, and he became an investigative judge for the trial for Treblinka. He traveled the world looking for witnesses to take statements from them, and it was up to, he was very much the founder of that trial that took place some years afterwards. When Herbert Sulzbach's time with the British Army, his time at Featherstone Park had come to an end, he hadn't finished with the British Army. He still had a few more months to run, and he was sent to Berlin. And he was shocked to return to a Berlin that he had known prior to the war and find this sort of thing. He wasn't there for very long. He was there as part of the airlift of the late 1948. And then he had to look for a job. And he didn't have a job, and he didn't have any money, and he couldn't find a job throughout 1949. And then in the early 50s, and the emerging German consulate came into being in London, and Herbert Sulzbach volunteered to go and work for it. And after many discussions, he was taken on as a member of staff, a local member of staff. And you can see here a reception. I think many of you know the ambassador on the far left, Karl Gunther von Hauser. He's talking to the guest who had come with. In the center is Yehudi Menuhin, and on the far right is Herbert Sulzbach with next to Beate, his wife. Many receptions took place, and also Herbert Sulzbach went out to visit particularly young people. He, as in his work at the embassy, was in the press and cultural department, and he wanted very much to involve young people in the new relationship between Germany and England. Here's Ambassador von Hauser presenting Herbert Sulzbach with the Grand Cross of Merit on his, I think, 77th birthday. Herbert Sulzbach went to work in what became the German embassy in 1951, and he left in 1981, 30 years later, aged 87. So if you're thinking of retiring, 87. And this reception, Herbert Sulzbach, the third from the left, is standing with his hand on the shoulder of an ex-prisoner of war and two members of the German military, when he had his book of his diary from the First World War was published in English in 1973. It was a very proud day for him. And here he is in his office. I'm going to go quickly through these because I know we want to have some questions. And town twinning was something else that was important, try to make connections between Germany and Britain. And this I found in the middle of France in a place called Noyon. And just as I was crossing the road, I find that there's a sign that says that's 820 kilometres left to Hexham, which was just round the corner from Featherstone Park prisoner of war camp, so it seemed a most extraordinary coincidence. In the 1960s, Herbert Sulzbach's ex-prisoners, wanted to make a lasting grouping that would further Anglo-German friendship. And they created the Featherstone Park Association. You can see Kurt Schwiderski's signature 2 or 3 from the top, and he became the secretary. And this was an association that had annual meetings, usually in Dusseldorf, and sometimes English, sometimes German. This is Terence Pretty, who was a journalist working for for a British newspaper working in Britain, in Germany. And here is a picture. On the right is Rainer Doppelstein, who's one of your members in Bonn, who was a diplomat in the early 1980s and knew Herbert Sulzbach very well. Featherstone Park, there's nothing there now. This is what's there. If you know what you're looking for, you can find some remains of the huts on the ground, but you can still see a plaque. And this is the plaque that got me going on writing this book at all, because it didn't make any sense to me. Here was the entrance to Prisoner of War Camp 18, where thousands of German officers were held in the years 1945 to 48. The interpreter since January 1946 was Captain Herbert Sulzbach, OBE, who dedicated himself to making this camp a seedbed of British-German reconciliation. Our two nations owe him heartfelt thanks, the friends and members of the Featherstone Park Association of former inmates of Camp 18, 1982. And Kurt Schwiderski was there for the unveiling of this plaque, as were other ex-prisoners of war and friends. And Schwiderski, standing by that plaque, which was by the gate where he had spent over 2 years as a prisoner, said to Sulzbach, who was standing at his side, "It was a long journey that you began here more than 36 years ago, but every journey which will lead to reconciliation after years of war and animosity or even hate is a long one. In the same way, it needs a great deal of time if you want to get a seedling out of a seed bed, and if you wish the seedling to grow up to a real tree. I think one can now speak of a real tree in connection with the idea of reconciliation." It was a freezing cold day, so afterwards they all went up to the pub just round the corner. And here you can see Sulzbach on the right, Schwiderski in the middle, and on the left of the picture is Henry Falk, who was Herbert Sulzbach's boss during the Second World War in Britain. And here you see him on his 90th birthday, Herbert Sulzbach. And on that occasion, Kurt Schwiderski was there at the embassy to give a speech in honour of Herbert Sulzbach. And then one of the last things that Herbert Sulzbach ever did in 1984, the year before he died, a few months before he died, in fact, was to be the guest of honour at the last church service of some First World War veterans, English veterans. The man on the left is their oldest member, and Herbert Sulzbach was there as the guest of the opposing army, if you like. He phoned a friend the night before and said, "What medal do you think I should wear? Should I wear my English decoration of the OBE or my German Order of Merit?" And the friend said, "Wear them both." And so Herbert Sulzbach took no notice and put them all on, and he's wearing all 9 medals there. And this is my last slide to show you. It's called Reconciliation. I took this picture in Berlin, in point of fact. It's, you may well know it, some of you. It's on the site of the old Berlin Wall. And there's another one in Coventry in England. There's one in Northern Ireland, and there's one in Japan. And it's made by a Portuguese woman artist. And the idea at the time was, the story behind it is 2 individuals who at the end of the Second World War completely had lost touch with each other. They were, in fact, at far ends of Europe, each of them, but they wanted to get back together again. And so they started walking, and they started walking and walking to the place that they hoped the other would also go to. And they did find each other. And this is the 2 of them embracing on their reunion. And since that sculpture was made for that reason, it has come now very much to represent nations who do much the same thing. And it is my ending of talking about a man who'd hoped so much for Anglo-German reconciliation. And so thank you very much for listening. And if you want I mean, I'm not sure how many of you are there who would want to read it, but if you want the chapter sent to you, send me your email. There's my email address and my website address, and I should be delighted to hear from anybody and send on a copy of the chapter. So I'll stop sharing my slides now, and thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry to have gone over the time that you said was right.
Thank you very much indeed. This has been really interesting and indeed moving to hear this story. It's most particularly because we're again at the time where reconciliation is a real catchword and something we need to really strive to have. Before I give you all the occasion, I forgot at the beginning to just mention that this session is being recorded so that you can then listen in at a later date as well. You did all mute your microphones. Thank you very much, and you may want to do so while you keep your cameras on. If you have questions, please just put them in the chat and we'll try and pick as many as we can. My first question is simply out of curiosity. No, before I ask a question, I should just mention that Karl Günther von Hase, whom you talked about, was once the head of our society, of the German-British Society. He died not very long ago. And is extremely well remembered in the Deutsch-Britische Gesellschaft. Yeah. And perhaps just to add that bit, as a small boy, I was taken in Germany to a concert that Yehudi Menuhin gave in Germany. This must have been something like 1957 or perhaps 58. And of course, as a small boy, I didn't realize at the time, it only dawned on me much later, what an enormous thing that was, that Yehudi Menuhin would come and perform in Germany again, which he did quite frequently, actually. Now, my question, just out of curiosity, you had this extraordinary collection of photos from Frankfurt, from Berlin, and things. How come they sort of survived, and how were they made available to you to use them? Of course, they illustrate the early history and later history at all very well indeed.
I was very fortunate indeed in meeting Herbert Sulzbach's niece, and she has all his papers. And she became very generous about allowing me to see absolutely everything. She allowed me to take away from her home in London cardboard box after cardboard box of letters and papers and documents. And I mean, I think it's in the acknowledgements that I say that one day she just came puffing her way into into her room when I'd visited her to see what else she'd got to be able to share with me, and she just dumped this box on the floor and said, "And these are his school reports." And I have so much that does not got anywhere near the book, but it included all the family albums. And Herbert Sulzbach was a very, very keen photographer, and he documented his youth and early times. And they had a lot of money. They could go away on holiday and stuff like this. So much of the information, many letters, documents, photos come from his niece, who, if you remember the photograph of the two women on the boat leaving, there was Beata and Ruth. So I'm talking about Ruth's daughter.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Wow. Well, it is amazing that these photos were still there, and probably all the documents from pre-war days and things. And of course, there were sources. I write too, and I'm always interested in sources and where to get information from. And so this was of course a great occasion. How did you come to get interested in Herbert Sulzbach? What made you start the book in the first place?
Clark at Featherstone Park. We were spending a weekend as a family in the area. We didn't live in that area, but we were holidaying there, and went for a walk along the River South Tyne, and came across this plaque with a field of cows beyond it. It didn't make any sense at all. The wording on the plaque just didn't hang together. The German name with an English honor decoration, OBE, how you could describe anything there as a seedbed of reconciliation was no sense at all. I didn't at the time, forgive my ignorance, but at the time I did not realize that German prisoners were kept in our country way after the end of the Second World War. Yeah. And so I couldn't quite fathom this 1945 to 1948, why was anybody here? And none of it made any sense at all. And I'd just finished one type of work, one area of work. And my husband said to me, well, if you want something to do, you could find out about that guy. And so I went to the local library, not far from Hexham, first of all, to say, what does anybody know about this place? And as it happened, the librarian, who was Jewish himself, and a local historian, did know about it. And the previous year, it had been something like 50 years since the camp closed or something. And so he had thought we ought to have some recognition of this. And so he had written to as many people involved with the camp as he could to put on an exhibition at the library. And this had happened the year prior to my turning up. And so when I arrived and said, what do you know? He said, well, it's really useful now because I've got a use for all of this exhibition that I put up, because when the exhibition finished, he didn't know what to do with it. So he took it down, put it in a box and put it on a shelf in the library. And I had a ready source of amazing, inspirational letters and contacts straight away. So that got me going. And then I spent years reading about the area, Jewish people during that time. Anyway, one thing led to another, and it finished with the book.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. I mean, German prisoners of war were kept by all the Allies for some years after the war, by the Russians for as much as 10 years. There's a very famous story of Adenauer going to Moscow in 1955 to retrieve the last 15,000 German prisoners of war. But to my knowledge, it was only the Brits who had this urge to sort of convey a message of learning, of teaching, of reconciliation, and so on. The Americans, to a certain extent, the French didn't keep them for very long, and the Russians not at all. For the Russians, it was just cheap labor and nothing else. So I think it was an amazing feat. Now we have a question here in the chat. Do you know what happened to Herbert Sulzbach's daughter?
Not a great deal. She became slightly estranged from him for many years at one point. She married an Englishman. In fact, she married an Englishman in 1940, in May 1940. She was still quite young, 19 or 20, and she married an Englishman who was a conscientious objector. Not Herbert's cup of tea, particularly, because he, as you will appreciate, felt that you should fight for what you believe in. And he was very much a soldier. But anybody who belonged to the organization, I think it's called the Peace Pledge Union or something, as this young man did, was suspect in the eyes of the British military. And so their flat, the young couple's flat, was visited by the police, who said to them, "You have to give us the names and addresses of all your next of kin," which obviously included Herbert. And so the police turned up at his flat, and they looked through all of his documents and took a couple of them away. And one of them was just something financial to do with his Dutch shares or something. And the other one was a letter that he had sent to an aunt of his wife before they were married in 1923, when the French invaded the Ruhr. And he was very, very angry. Herbert at the time was very, very angry about it. And he was living in Germany. And the aunt of his wife, who lived in America, said in a letter something like, "Well, the Germans, it's only what the Germans did, beforehand or something. It's their fault." And he was furious. And he said to his fiancée at that time, "I will reply to this." And so he replied to the aunt, and at the end of it, he said, "The Allies will regret this." And when Herbert was called in front of the tribunal in May 1940, he and Beata, this was the letter that was incriminating for him, that they said, "Well, you're a Nazi then, obviously, aren't you?" And sent him to an internment camp. That was not what estranged him from his daughter or granddaughter, indeed. But some years later, this daughter, who by then had an 18-year-old daughter of her own, and by then Herbert was working at the embassy, the daughter wanted to go to Germany as an au pair. And so Herbert said, "Oh, I can probably arrange something or help you." "No, that's fine. I can make my own arrangements." And so I think she did. And when she came back, she visited Herbert in the embassy, and he thought how did you get on and what was it like? And she had actually been an au pair in a family that still held very, very right-wing attitudes, and who she came back saying, well, this family say, well, you know, the Nazis were doing it right, really, weren't they? And that was what they did for the Jews was fine, you know. And considering quite a few members of Herbert's family had died anyway, being killed during the war as a result of these policies, as apart from anything that he believed in, he took great exception to his granddaughter, who, in fact, it was not only parroting what she had had from this family in Germany, but also passing on some of the ideas that her mother had managed to pick up as well. And so he threw them both out. And it was many years before they were anything like reconciled. And his daughter obviously was the daughter from Margot, his first wife. And when Margot died, then the daughter was back in touch with Herbert. But there is a letter that says something like, you better send me a questionnaire so that I can answer the questions, because we don't really know anything much about each other. But then her daughter went to teach and live in Portugal for many years, and I think was not much in touch, unfortunately. Yeah. So the reconciliation doesn't, these things are complicated.
Are there any other questions or comments that you would like to make? I have nothing more in the chat here, but perhaps
I will just say, because you mentioned Yehudi Menuhin, that he I quickly find he was a great supporter of Featherstone Park. I'm not quite sure why. Herbert Sulzbach was a great person for networking. He would have loved living in the modern age when there's so much networking you can do. His was a much more traditional sort, but he knew Yehudi Menuhin very well. And Yehudi Menuhin said of Featherstone Park camp healed and encouraged the human heart and spirit. Instead of wounding and destroying life, instead of awakening hate and intolerance, it furthered and generated the only basic principle of mankind's survival, that is, mutual respect and mutual trust. So yeah, he was a great friend.
Yeah, thank you. Now I have two more questions here. First one is David Field. Please go ahead.
Just a small item. I just wondered whether the camp commandant was able to speak German. You said he got through very well to people.
As far as I know, he didn't. He may have had a smattering of German, in that he had been a prisoner of war in Germany himself in the First World War, but he relied on interpreters to deal with most things, and it was very much the German speakers who interpreted for him. Either Herbert Sulzbach was not the only interpreter, there were one or two others as well, but he was the sort of chief among them, and General Heim, who was the spokesman for all of the German prisoners. But his Colonel Vickers, the commandant's demeanor was always so jovial, so very cheerful and responsive to people. I think it was sort of on a human level that he did that. I don't know whether the quote that I gave you about when he went round to see the men when they first arrived, he may have had more known more German than I'm attributing him to him, but I'm not aware he was a great German speaker.
And of course, on the German side, very, very few people did speak English in those days. I mean, nowadays, of course, most Germans speak a certain amount of English, but in those days they didn't. People who'd gone to a gymnasium had learned Latin and Greek, but no English. And sort of very educated people would tend to know some French, but again, English speakers were rare in Germany, and so among the prisoners of war, there were probably quite few who could actually converse in English.
Yes, I think the only reason that Herbert Sulzbach knew English was because he had this live-in governess. She was a member of the staff in the house. But the reason that it was sometimes very difficult for the camp to find speakers for their lecture series was that the people had to be good German speakers to get over the language barrier. It wasn't so much because some of the officers German officers could follow the lecture, but there was no when it came to questions and answers, there couldn't be anything, and this was seen to be a very important part of the lecture, that it actually stirred up some interest like that.
It's quite recent that this has changed, actually. I mean, it's still quite extraordinary how badly some Germans speak English, and then they don't dare to sort of, make the remark.
I never meet them.
Mari, you had a question.
Yes, so before I ask my question, my grandfather, we sort of skipped a generation. He was born in 1898. So he spoke English because he was a prisoner of war in the UK in the First World War. So presumably a lot of the prisoners of war in Featherstone also learned English there. But that's not what I wanted to say. I just wanted to ask you if you could speak a bit more about his time at the embassy and the work he was doing there in the cultural department. Were there any, sort of specific tasks or responsibilities that he took on, that he was working on?
Yes, thank you. It's really good. I'm sorry, because of the time, I rather skipped the embassy bit, which was bad. When Herbert Sulzbach first went to what it was then a consulate in 1951, I think there were only about 7 of them working there at all. And so he was the press and cultural department, and he was responsible for anything to do with information about Germany or anything like that. He saw it as a sort of continuation of his work as a prisoner of war camp, of informing both sides about what was going on, if you like. It was getting out a lot of information to English people about what Germany was really like. And this was a totally uphill task for years and years and years. The son of Kurt Schwiderski told me that he remembers Herbert Sulzbach sending letters in the late 70s and 80s about the tough time they were having at the embassy with anti-German feelings. And in the 1970s, the television programs in England were just appalling. I mean, they're still not great when it comes to portraying Germany, I don't think. But at the time then, he had a huge amount of representation work, of trying to represent the new Germany, and cutting through English cultural stuff was really difficult. It was partly that made him really try hard to get information into schools, and deal with young people. He felt that the more people mixed with other people or learned more about each other, the more likelihood there would be that that some understanding between people could take place. He helped schools to try to find other groups that they could liaise with, they could learn about. One of the characters, if you like, in the book is a teacher from Newcastle who just decided sometime in the 1970s that it was about time his school children who were aged about 13 knew a bit more about a European country, and he just hit on Germany as a country to go for, and so he sent a letter to the embassy saying, can I have some information about Germany so that I can pass on stuff to the children, etc. And of course, he got put straight on to Herbert Sulzbach. And as ever, because this happened time and time again, Herbert Sulzbach became a lifelong friend and visited the school and spoke to the children, and until his dying day sent tapes at Christmas and all sorts of things like this. There was a lot of communication and making exchanges on a cultural level of people. There was a lot more willingness in Germany for German people, I think this is still the case, for German people to have those links with England than the other way around. But he tried to facilitate all of these ideas. He got involved with town twinnings. He often instigated a town twinning if somebody came up with the idea that it might be possible, and tried to get the ball rolling and then pass it back onto the various towns involved, because these things could take quite a long time to organise. And he really felt that this is an extension of what happened in the prisoner of war camp, because the Featherstone Park, for example, had 4 theatres, a radio station, 4 orchestras of one sort or another, and they all, once German prisoners were allowed to mix with the local population, everybody was delighted to actually have these things going on in their village halls or their churches or this type of thing, and so it is an extension that he worked through those means of trying to get out information, trying to make connections between people that would be meaningful and last. I don't know if that helps to answer Marie's question.
Having somebody in the German embassy, in the cultural department, who would be there for a very long time and would sort of do things, was actually German government policy in the 1950s, when the German diplomatic service sort of started again after the war. There was somebody in Paris who was very famous. I can't remember the name. There was one in Brussels. There was one in Rome. There was one, Herbert Sulzbach, in London. So it was definitely a policy. It wasn't just by chance that he landed up there. I have 2 more questions, and then we really do have to finish. We're a bit over time anyway. I have a question here in the chat from Martin Nasra, who says, would you be able to say how was Herbert Sulzbach's reaction when he learned of the German crimes against humanity? Difficult one.
Yeah, it was very difficult for all Jewish people to really cope with that. I think he felt that he already knew a lot of what was going on. When these things became in the public domain, they had been known about at different levels of before that. So it wasn't completely new, although the extent of them was perhaps new. One of the first things that when Herbert Sulzbach was working at Cymru at Coulty Brecon with the young prisoners there, one of the first things after the end of the war that the British government required all prisoners to see was the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. And this was a film, and they were all and I don't think it was all prisoners. When I was in Germany last year, somebody in Munster was telling me that it was all Germans. So it happened in Germany itself as well, I think. But all the prisoners at Kulturbrücken had to see this film, and Herbert, obviously it was not new to him then, and a booklet was made of the atrocities with photos and things like this, which he had duplicated for the prisoners. And he was when he noticed their response, some of which was made in Hollywood, it can't have happened, end of, or complete being appalled at what had been done in their name. He was incredibly generous towards these young men about, well, at least it shows that there's a way forward now through them knowing this. Himself, like most Jewish people, he spent, and Beata spent a lot of time in second half of 1945 and during 1946, just trying to find out what had happened to people that they knew. His own parents had died before the beginning of the war in 1932 and 1934. There weren't a lot of children involved in the family. So very few of his immediate family were immediately affected by this in a way. But he was often asked, what do you do with your own feelings? What do you do with your own hate? And time again, he reiterated that hate and hating was demeaning to people and had no place in any person's life, and he refused to be drawn into anything negative about it at all. He was an incredibly positive-minded person. Whether that meant some sort of denial as well, I wouldn't know, but that it was a gradual process for him. When he was working in Basel before the Second World War was even declared, he was trying to tell people what he knew was within the Nazi psyche. And so I don't think it was too much of a shock in some respects.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Last question from Renate Kinzinger. You'll have to unmute your microphone. Otherwise, we can't hear.
Yeah, it's actually not a question. It's just a comment saying how absolutely amazed I am that in these days you just walk through the Tattershill Park and then you see the plaque, and I mean, how many hundreds or thousands of people have been through there and walked there, and I say, oh, okay, good, and then just walk on. and you say, well, you know, I want to find out.
Yeah.
And then you dig out that story. Mm-hmm. I'm also impressed about your memory that you know, you have all the dates and names, and so and you're so fortunate that you got all the documents. So I mean, it needs somebody like you. Just that I do it.
No.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations.
Thank you, Renata. Thank you very much.
This is a beautiful closing remarks. I didn't really add anything to that, except saying thank you. Thank you very much indeed. It's been extraordinarily interesting, and I hope your book will sell well, and a lot of people hopefully will learn more about this particular aspect. Thanks a lot, and thank you all for attending this
Thank you.
session. Thank you.
Thank you.